Hoa Karen knew she had lost the battle, but she wasn't ready to concede defeat. After days of pacing in her grand mansion, she realized one thing. Jack Davis had outsmarted her at every turn. It stung. The once self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood now found herself humiliated. Her reign toppled, and her power slipping through her fingers. But as she sat, staring out the window at Jack's fortress-like property, her mind began to churn. "This isn't over," she muttered to herself, a wicked smile creeping across her face. The war wasn't lost. It was merely postponed. Determined to get back at Jack, Hoa Karen began to plot her comeback. She made calls to influential people in the community, digging up old alliances, and even using her charm to manipulate a few local officials. "They won't even see it coming," she whispered, plotting each move with the precision of a seasoned strategist. But there was one thing Hoa Karen didn't count on: her overconfidence. As she prepared to execute her revenge, she found herself caught in a web of her own making. Her former allies were no longer as loyal. Her power was more fragile than ever, and the cracks in her facade were starting to show. To fuel her determination, Hoa Karen began spreading rumors, planting false information about Jack's supposedly illegal activities. She thought she could turn the entire neighborhood against him, but Jack was always one step ahead. Jack, ever the calm and calculating man, had already anticipated her moves. The tension in the air was palpable as Hoa Karen's plans unfolded, each twist and turn adding more fuel to the fire. It was a game of cat and mouse, with Jack playing the patient hunter and Hoa Karen acting like a desperate prey. But things weren't all bad for Hoa Karen. In her desperation, she accidentally caused a series of humorous events. She had hired a private investigator to follow Jack, but the investigator, distracted by her over-the-top demands, ended up getting caught in a series of embarrassing situations, leading to some comic relief for the neighborhood. Her attempts to gain the upper hand were turning into a circus, and Jack couldn't help but smirk at the spectacle. The real showdown was coming, and both sides were ready for a final battle, each prepared to give everything they had. It was a war that no one in the neighborhood would soon forget. Jack knew that defeating Hoa Karen was only the first step in this battle. The real challenge lay in keeping the upper hand, and to do that, he needed help. People who shared his vision, his fight, and his resolve. So, Jack began to reach out to others in the neighborhood. People who had been victims of Hoa Karen's tyranny, or who had silently suffered her control for years. But it wasn't as easy as he thought. When Jack knocked on the door of Quinn Alexander, a seasoned but weary neighbor, he was greeted with a reluctant sigh. "Jack, I've seen enough of Hoa Karen to last a lifetime," Quinn muttered, rubbing his temples. "I'm too old for this. I've spent years trying to avoid conflict." But Jack's determination was contagious. He didn't back down. He laid out a plan. Simple, but powerful. "This is about more than just a woman who's drunk on power. This is about taking our lives back. Together we can win." Slowly, Quinn's resistance melted away, and he agreed to join Jack's cause. But not without warning. "Don't expect me to go easy on her. I'm in this to win." Next, Jack reached out to Maya Lane, a young mother who had always been terrified of Hoa Karen's grip on the neighborhood. "I can't risk my kids' safety for a fight," she said, her voice trembling. But Jack wasn't just asking for her help. He was offering a chance for her children to grow up in a community where they could breathe easy, free from Hoa Karen's overbearing rules. "You're not just helping me, Maya," Jack said, his voice steady. "You're giving your kids a future." After a long pause, Maya finally nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "You're right. Let's do this." The group was coming together, but they were far from united. Toby Young, a fiery and outspoken neighbor, couldn't help but push buttons. "We need to act fast, Jack. If we keep waiting, Hoa Karen will only get more dangerous." His urgency was palpable, but Jack wasn't swayed. "Patience, Toby," Jack said with a smirk. "We'll take her down when the time is right. And trust me, we'll enjoy every second of it." As Jack's newly formed alliance began to take shape, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Quinn, Maya, Toby, and Jack all had one thing in common: a shared hatred for Hoa Karen. But that didn't mean they were united in every aspect. The group's internal conflicts became more and more apparent as they worked together. Quinn, with his years of experience, took a more cautious approach, always reminding the group of the risks involved. "We can't go in guns blazing, Jack. This is a marathon, not a sprint," he warned, his voice tinged with frustration. But Toby, ever the hothead, wasn't having it. "We don't have time for your slow and steady nonsense. We need to act, and we need to act now." His impatience was almost contagious, but Jack could see where both men were coming from. Maya, who had been the most reluctant member of the group, found herself caught in the middle of their bickering. She had joined the fight to protect her children, but now she was feeling overwhelmed by the constant arguing. "I just want to get rid of Hoa Karen and make this place safe for my family," she said, rubbing her temples. "All this drama between you two is just exhausting." Her frustration was a wake-up call for the group, but it didn't stop the tension from building. The situation was becoming less about Hoa Karen and more about personal egos, and that could tear everything apart. Jack, the leader of the group, struggled to keep the peace. He knew that their success depended not just on defeating Hoa Karen, but on finding a way to work together. But it wasn't easy. One morning, during a particularly heated argument between Quinn and Toby over their next move, Maya, in an unexpected burst of humor, jokingly suggested, "What if we just give Hoa Karen a vacation? Send her to a deserted island and see how she survives without her power trips?" The laughter that followed broke the tension, if only for a moment. But Jack knew it wouldn't be that simple. The group was fractured, but they had no choice but to press on. Each person had their own reasons for fighting, their own baggage, and their own way of doing things. They needed to find a balance if they were going to succeed. The stakes were higher now, and the clock was ticking. With Hoa Karen's power slipping, she was becoming more unpredictable, and that made her even more dangerous. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something much bigger than just a neighborhood feud. Hoa Karen was losing her grip, and she could feel it. Every day, she saw more and more of her support crumbling. People who once bowed to her now rolled their eyes at her antics. Her attempts to assert control had become laughable. One morning, as she stormed through the neighborhood, she overheard two elderly women gossiping on their porch. "Oh, Hoa Karen, she used to run this place," one of them said, chuckling. "Now she's just a punchline." The words stung, but she refused to show weakness. Inside, however, her pride was on the verge of breaking. Desperate to hold on to the last shreds of her power, Hoa Karen resorted to increasingly erratic tactics. She began showing up unannounced at residents' doors, demanding that they comply with her rules no one had ever agreed to. The neighbors, however, weren't as intimidated as they once were. Maya Lane, who had been so fearful before, finally stood up to Hoa Karen. "You're not in charge anymore, Karen," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "We're done with your nonsense." The confrontation was a turning point. Hoa Karen's face twisted with rage, but she couldn't argue. Her threats fell flat. Her once certain authority had melted away. The sheer absurdity of the situation made it almost comical. Hoa Karen, who had once controlled everything, was now reduced to pleading for respect. It was almost as if the universe was mocking her, stripping away the power she had so ruthlessly clung to. But instead of retreating, Hoa Karen doubled down. Her next move was bold and utterly ridiculous. She held a so-called town meeting in the middle of the street, complete with flyers and a loudspeaker. "This is it? The final stand," she announced, dramatically waving her arms. "You will all regret defying me." But the neighborhood was done with her theatrics. People showed up, but instead of taking her seriously, they brought popcorn and lawn chairs, treating her spectacle like a comedy show. Even Jack couldn't help but laugh, though he knew this wasn't the end. Hoa Karen had crossed a line, and her desperation made her even more dangerous. But the fact that she was now the butt of the joke didn't escape anyone. It was a fitting end to her reign, and Jack knew that her downfall was just around the corner. Amidst the ongoing battle, Jack found himself in uncharted territory. What started as a simple mission to protect his property had evolved into a much deeper, more personal struggle. As the weeks dragged on, he couldn't deny the growing feelings he had for Maya Lane. She was strong, determined, and, despite her initial fears, had proven to be a fierce ally. Jack had always prided himself on his ability to stay focused, but every time Maya spoke up in their strategy meetings, his heart skipped a beat. He had to admit it. He was falling for her. It wasn't just the way her eyes sparkled when she was determined, or the way she'd throw herself into their plans without hesitation. It was the little things, like the way she'd smile when she caught him off guard, or the way she supported him when things seemed bleak. Jack wasn't used to feeling this way. His life had always been about logic, strategy, and keeping things under control. But Maya made him forget all of that, even if only for a moment. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, Jack found himself walking beside Maya toward their homes. The silence between them felt comfortable, but there was a tension in the air, one that neither of them dared to acknowledge. Finally, Maya broke the silence. "You know, Jack," she said, her voice soft but serious, "you've been working so hard. You've been doing this for everyone. For me. Don't forget to take care of yourself, too." Jack turned to look at her, his chest tightening. "I don't know if I could do this without you, Maya," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, charged with a new, unspoken meaning. Maya's eyes softened, and for the briefest of moments their hands brushed. Before either of them could react, the moment was broken by a loud crash, a car backfiring. They both jumped, laughing awkwardly. "Well, that was dramatic," Maya said, a playful grin on her face. Jack couldn't help but laugh, too, the tension easing just a little. It wasn't the perfect romantic moment he'd imagined, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, he realized that this battle wasn't just about defeating Hoa Karen. It was about something far more important, learning to trust, to let down his guard, and maybe, just maybe, to open his heart. Jack had known the courtroom battle with Hoa Karen was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the full extent of her deception. As the trial began, Hoa Karen's lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man with a reputation for bending the law, launched into a tirade, painting Jack as a dangerous rebel who had violated every regulation in the book. His words were sharp, aimed to manipulate the jury's emotions. "This man," he pointed toward Jack, "has jeopardized the safety of our entire neighborhood. He's a threat to our community." The room tensed, but Jack didn't flinch. His eyes remained focused, knowing his time to strike was coming. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't waste any time. "What you just heard," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of conviction, "are nothing but lies." His words rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. He stood tall, a quiet confidence emanating from him as he methodically dismantled each accusation. He pulled out zoning laws and property permits, showing how every step he took had been legal. "I didn't build that trench and drawbridge for fun," Jack continued, a smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. "It was a necessary measure to protect my home. And let's not forget," he paused dramatically, his eyes scanning the room, "the real threat to this community, Hoa Karen." He handed the judge a thick folder, the contents undeniable. "What we have here," Jack said, "are financial records, showing how Hoa Karen misappropriated HOA funds for personal gain. Not only that, but her shady dealings and manipulation of elections are all documented." The courtroom gasped. Even Hoa Karen's own lawyer faltered. Jack had set the trap, and now it was sprung. The once confident Hoa Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face draining of color. The very person who had manipulated the HOA, the person who had caused so much fear and uncertainty, was now exposed for the fraud she truly was. For a moment, the tension in the air felt like it might suffocate everyone in the room. But then, a hushed chuckle rippled through the audience. Jack had done it. He had turned the tables, outsmarting Hoa Karen at her own game. The judge, seeing the weight of the evidence, turned to Hoa Karen's lawyer and said, "This case is over." Jack could hardly believe it. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and Hoa Karen was about to face the consequences of her years of manipulation. The victory was sweet, but Jack knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger change. Jack had always known that Hoa Karen wasn't the kind of person to go down quietly. Even after the courtroom defeat, she was still scheming, still trying to find a way to claw her way back to power. But Jack, with his legal acumen and sharp eye for detail, had been expecting this. He wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. It all started when Jack received an anonymous tip-off one evening. The message was simple. Look at Hoa Karen's HOA, financial records from the past year. It was a little too convenient, but Jack didn't ignore the opportunity. He knew Hoa Karen well enough to understand she was always one step ahead, so he needed to be too. He immediately went to work, digging into the HOA's financial statements. What he uncovered was a gold mine. Hoa Karen had been using her position to skim funds from the HOA, funneling money into personal accounts, funding lavish vacations, and even bribing contractors for overpriced, unnecessary repairs. Jack's jaw tightened as he sifted through the evidence, each page adding more fuel to the fire. But what caught his eye wasn't just the financial discrepancies. It was the signatures on the documents, the names of board members, all of whom had either been manipulated or coerced into signing off on Hoa Karen's shady dealings. Some were barely legible, suggesting they hadn't even looked at the documents before signing. It was clear now, Hoa Karen wasn't just a power-hungry dictator. She was a criminal, playing with the lives and money of the very people who trusted her. With a grin, Jack began laying out his next move. He gathered his allies, including Maya and Quinn, who were equally stunned by the evidence. Together, they began contacting the local authorities, preparing to take this case to the next level. The stakes had just gotten higher. The moment of truth came when Jack stood before the board of the HOA, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable authority. He presented the evidence piece by piece, exposing Hoa Karen's manipulations. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the corruption set in. Hoa Karen's smug expression faltered for the first time. Jack watched with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that this was the beginning of the end for her reign of terror. The truth had come to light, and there was no escaping it now. Hoa Karen had underestimated Jack, and now she was about to pay the price. Despite the mounting pressure of the legal battles and Hoa Karen's desperate attempts to regain control, there were moments of unexpected humor that broke the tension. Jack had always prided himself on being methodical, focused, and calm, but even he couldn't help but laugh at the ridiculousness of some situations that kept unfolding. One afternoon, after a particularly heated meeting where Hoa Karen had stormed out in a dramatic huff, Jack and his allies decided to take a breather. They gathered in Maya's living room, trying to relax after days of strategizing. But the stress was getting to everyone. "All right, we need a break," Jack said, slumping onto the couch, "before we turn into the angry mob we're trying to prevent." Quinn, always the serious one, let out a deep sigh. His brow furrowed as he glanced out the window. "I'm too old for this nonsense," he grumbled. "I haven't been this stressed since my kids tried to set up a lemonade stand without asking me first." Maya, on the other hand, cracked a smile. "Lemonade stand? I think you're being a little dramatic, Quinn. Besides, we all know the real chaos is about to happen when we finally get Hoa Karen to admit to all her lies." Toby, always the instigator, leaned forward with a mischievous grin. "You know what we need? A little prank to lighten the mood. Maybe switch Hoa Karen's HOA meeting flyers with invitations to a comedy show," he suggested, raising his eyebrows. "Imagine her face when she thinks she's hosting a neighborhood meeting and finds a clown juggling instead of a committee." The room erupted with laughter, the tension temporarily lifting. Even Jack had to admit that Toby's suggestion was brilliant. For a moment, they were able to forget about the fight, the power struggles and the constant pressure. It was just a group of people coming together, finding solace in the absurdity of it all. But the laughter didn't last long. As they returned to their plans, their resolve grew stronger. They were no longer just fighting Hoa Karen's power. They were fighting for their peace of mind, their homes, and their sense of belonging. The humor, however, was a reminder that they were in this together, and no matter how ridiculous the battle seemed, they could always find a way to laugh in the face of adversity. The battle was far from over, but Jack knew that the combination of strategy, wit, and humor would be the key to bringing down Hoa Karen once and for all. Jack had been preparing for this moment for weeks. He had carefully planned each step, watching Hoa Karen's every move, learning her habits, and understanding her weaknesses. But now, as the final confrontation loomed, he knew he needed something bold, something that would completely outsmart her. Jack's mind was sharp, his plan brilliant, but this time, he was going to take it one step further. He wasn't just going to win, he was going to do it in a way that would make Hoa Karen look ridiculous. The moment arrived during the next HOA meeting, and Jack, confident and cool as ever, strolled into the room with an air of unshakable calm. Hoa Karen, already perched at the front, shot him a glare as he took his seat. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. Everyone knew something big was coming, but none of them could have predicted what Jack had up his sleeve. As Hoa Karen began her usual tirade, full of bluster and threats, Jack quietly stood up. "Before we continue," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, "I think we need to address something important." A few curious heads turned toward him, but most of the room was still distracted by Hoa Karen's theatrics. Then, with the smallest of smiles, Jack pulled out a small, unassuming folder from his bag and slid it onto the table. The room fell silent. Hoa Karen's eyes widened, her composure slipping just a fraction. "What is that?" she demanded, her voice no longer the confident tone it had once been. Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid the folder in front of her, allowing everyone to see the papers inside. "These," he began, "are copies of Hoa Karen's secret dealings with contractors, forged signatures, and financial mismanagement. This little piece of evidence shows how she's been siphoning HOA, funds for personal gain." The room erupted in shock. Hoa Karen's face turned an almost comical shade of red as Jack calmly listed each piece of evidence, his words as sharp as a scalpel. The crowd was captivated, hanging on every word. The power dynamic in the room shifted. Hoa Karen stammered, trying to deny the truth, but her voice faltered. But Jack wasn't finished. With a quick glance around the room, he added, "And just to make things more interesting, I've also arranged for a live broadcast of today's meeting. Enjoy the show, Hoa Karen." The tension broke with laughter. Jack had turned her attempts to control the neighborhood into a circus, and now he was the one in control. This wasn't just about winning, it was about showing Hoa Karen how out of touch she had become. And in that moment, Jack knew he had finally won. The final chapter of Jack's battle was approaching, and the sense of anticipation hung thick in the air. Hoa Karen's reign had crumbled under the weight of her lies, manipulation, and the relentless efforts of Jack and his allies. But as the end drew near, Jack knew the most satisfying part of the victory would come not from the legal battles, but from the restoration of peace and justice in the neighborhood. Hoa Karen had underestimated him from the start, and now she was about to face the consequences of her actions. The day came when Hoa Karen was called into the final arbitration meeting, the one where the entire community would witness her downfall. The air was electric as people filled the room, eager to see the final act in this drama unfold. Jack, his allies, and even the remaining HOA members who had once feared Hoa Karen sat in anticipation. This was it, the moment they'd all been waiting for. When Hoa Karen entered, she no longer carried the aura of authority she once did. She was no longer the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. Her face was pale, her shoulders slumped. She stood at the front, glaring at Jack with a mixture of fury and disbelief. But Jack was unshaken, his eyes calm as he prepared to make his final statement. As the meeting commenced, Jack presented the overwhelming evidence, financial records, testimonies, and the very footage of Hoa Karen's threats and manipulations. One by one, he laid out the truth for everyone to see, revealing just how far Hoa Karen had gone to exploit her power. The room was silent. Then, as if she could no longer take the weight of her actions, Hoa Karen cracked. "You don't know what you're doing!" she screamed, her voice trembling. "I built this neighborhood. Without me, you would all be nothing." But no one was listening anymore. The laughter, once a sound of terror, now echoed in the room. The same people who had once feared her now stood united against her. Jack watched as the community, once fractured by Hoa Karen's greed, began to rebuild itself. He smiled, knowing that this wasn't just a victory over a tyrant. It was a triumph for everyone who had suffered in silence. And as Hoa Karen was escorted out, her once proud head hanging low, Jack felt a sense of satisfaction that wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure that no one would ever have to fear her again. The neighborhood was free. The battle was over. And Jack had won, not just for himself, but for everyone. The drawbridge that had once symbolized division now stood as a monument to resilience and justice. The neighborhood had been rebuilt, not by force, but by unity. And Jack knew deep down that they had all emerged stronger,